Like many other people, I've been a huge Wolverine fan since I was very young, right down to my sadly non-adamantium coated bones. And we knew that Logan would be Hugh Jackman's farewell to the character, so as far as I was concerned, this movie was serious business. I'm sure many of you shared in my relief when what we got was a film that was as beautiful in its scenes of bloodshed as it was in the reach of its piercing emotional impact. Director James Mangold's been very open about how the Western genre influenced the shape of Logan. The visuals are pretty obviously Western, complete with a posse of hired gunmen who ride through the landscape, trying to forcibly round up and exploit a smaller, more innocent group. And it certainly makes no difference to the stakes of that struggle that instead of peaceful settlers or townsfolk, it's a group of mutant children. So I think the real test of whether or not Logan has an actual identity as a Western really comes down to one thing. How does the grizzled character of Logan himself stack up against the protagonists of maybe more established Westerns, both old and new? And specifically, the lone gunman, the borderline outlaw, and other forms of the archetypal outsider Western protagonist. And the truth is, Westerns are not a genre that's kind to their protagonists the way many other genres definitely are. They aren't hospitable or nurturing. In fact, quite often, instead of being protective, they're downright abusive. One way we get evidence of that is that it's so common for this type of Western protagonist to be entirely built on failure and loss. The tragedy of Logan being unable to save any of his fellow X-Men during the Manchester incident, and then later being too late to protect his adoptive father, Xavier, is an emotional structure that plays out in many other Western characters too. Like Hugh Glass, for instance. We can see the psychological scars that losing his wife has left on him and his son, but the story goes further and forces Glass to lay paralyzed and watch as his son is then killed too. The sum of the suffering caused by these events makes up all we know about Hugh Glass, and really, it's all we need to know about him. I think there's something classically Western about telling you everything you need to know about a character just by taking something precious away from them. But that's not the only way the ghosts of the past often torment these characters, because it isn't just the losses of the past, but the sins of the past that so many Western protagonists are centered around. And most of the things that haunt them come from their profound skill and affinity for violence. Because even when they desperately try to escape from that part of themselves, like most human beings, their true nature follows them wherever they go. The best illustration I can think of is Clint Eastwood's character William Money in Unforgiven. He's chosen to abandon a life of killing and reform himself into a farmer and a father. When he thinks he's about to die, he even begs his friend Ned not to tell his children about the sort of man he used to be. But although he's so sincere in his desire to change and become something else entirely, in the end it's shown how very little effect 10 years of reformation have made to how steady his hands are as he kills other men.
Yeah.
Likewise, Logan spent his entire life either in wars, or being weaponized by evil men, or doing violence in the name of the X-Men. And although he's deeply wounded by the trauma of taking all those lives, he's never been able to find a way to derail the train of violence running through his life. And while the Western protagonist almost never glorifies violence itself, the way, say, many action movie stars do, it still creates a huge internal dichotomy. Because whether it's a megalomaniac sheriff or a paramilitary group cloning mutant children and trying to force them to become soldiers, the qualities of brutality and aggression that create the villains who prey on the weak and mild also exist in the lone gunman protagonists themselves. They can't hate their enemy without also hating themselves. They can't condemn them without also damning themselves, and in a lot of ways can't kill their enemy without also killing parts of themselves.
Actually, I was thinking of shooting myself, like Charles said.
Internal conflict and self-loathing that are as much a part of the character of Logan as his healing factor and claws are. And that internal conflict doesn't only affect the Western protagonist's relationship with himself, but with other people as well. At the end of the seminal Western Shane, which is heavily referenced in Logan itself, Shane tells Joey that the battle for the settlers' safety has been won, a victory illustrated and symbolized in the line,
Now you run on home to your mother and tell her everything's all right. There aren't any more guns in the valley.
But for that statement to be true, Shane himself has to leave, taking both his literal guns and the symbolic gun of his presence with him. Joey is young and naive and begs for Shane to stay, but the weary gunfighter knows that even if he never fired his guns again, the peaceful souls he protected with reluctant violence wouldn't be able to look at him as anything other than a killer, as a wielder of violence. And I think that's one of the reasons why Logan bonded so closely with Charles and placed so much of his hope in him. With his powers of telepathy, Xavier was probably the only person Logan had ever met who could fully look past his feral, violent exterior and see the man Logan truly was. And that isolation doesn't only turn them into, well, maybe not always an outlaw in the classical sense, but certainly someone not welcome in the inner sanctum of society and civilization. It also leads to the tragedy that even after the Western protagonist defeats the enemy at great cost to themselves, they aren't able to take part in the victory they've won. We see it in Shane, we see it in John Wayne's character Ethan in The Searchers, and in many others. So many of their stories end with them being forced or feeling compelled to tragically ride off into the sunset, either literally or symbolically. But when it comes to endings, there's another recent neo-Western film that struck me with how similar in spirit it felt to Logan, and that's Taylor Sheridan's Hell or High Water. Toby's had a rough life. He's lived all of it in poverty and lost his wife and his relationship with his sons to divorce. And the ending is true to tragic Western form in that although he does get away with the money heisted from the predatory bank, he loses his impulsive brother Tanner in the process. But the element that really sets Hell or High Water apart from many other Westerns is also what I think makes it so similar to Logan. Toby's only brother has gotten killed, the Texas Ranger Marcus Hamilton has promised violent retribution in the future, and none of the money Toby's heisted goes to benefiting his own life directly. However, the money has gone on to make a meaningful and lasting difference to the part of himself that his sons symbolically represent.
This is theirs now.
As Logan faces off against his final enemy, it isn't the first time. He's been losing to this same foe his entire life. The enemy of uncontrollable rage, of not just doing violence, but not being able to completely stop himself from enjoying it. The enemy of what his life has turned him into and his own nature itself, which he shares with so many other tortured Western protagonists. And in the end, even when those parts of him are literally made flesh and are killing him, Logan has no better of a chance of defeating them than he ever did. But Laura does, because as much as X-24 is an embodiment of all the very worst parts of Logan's self, Laura symbolically represents the other side of him, the part of him that not only holds hope for a better future, but in a way also hope for a better past. To help a piece of himself escape back over the Canadian border, back to where his story all began, and undo the loss of the past, and to begin again.
Don't be what they made you.
To break the cycle, if not for himself, then for the very real part of him that lives on in his daughter. Because Logan isn't just a Western, but the story of a man who all along has been desperately trying to escape the fate of being a Western protagonist. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see others like it, make sure to show me by hitting like and subscribing.